The chapel bell of Hollow Creek rang only once that morning. It wasn't the bright, joyful sound that carried over weddings or Sunday services. It was dull and hollow, like a heart that had forgotten how to hope. Dust swirled through the air, catching the thin sunlight that streamed through the cracked, stained glass. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar polish and wilted flowers. Clara Wynn stood alone before the altar, her gloved hands clasped tightly around a bouquet of white lilies already turning brown at the edges. She had sewn her own dress, a delicate, ivory creation of lace and ribbon, the finest she had ever made. Her fingers, used to stitching for others, had trembled when she stitched for herself. Now that same dress clung to her like a reminder of everything she had lost. The pews behind her were empty. Not a single chair creaked. Only the faint flutter of doves on the roof filled the silence. Through the chapel's open door, Clara could see the wide dirt road of Hollow Creek. Empty, too, except for a few townsfolk pretending to pass by, pretending not to stare. Their whispers carried easily on the dry wind. "Poor girl," someone muttered from across the street. "She thought that rancher was serious? Men like Thomas Granger don't marry seamstresses. I heard he left last night. Took his horse and half the dowry she saved." Clara heard them all. Every word. But she stood still, her chin lifted slightly, as if dignity was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. She took a slow breath, looked at the small gold ring resting in her palm, and whispered to herself, "You said you'd come, Thomas. You promised." Her voice trembled but didn't break. The priest, an elderly man with kind eyes, shifted uneasily near the altar. He had tried to persuade her to postpone the ceremony, but Clara had refused. "If God was to bless us," she had said earlier that morning, "then he can still hear me, whether Thomas is here or not." So the priest stayed, saying nothing now, watching her with quiet pity as she stepped forward. Clara closed her eyes. "I, Clara Wynn," she began softly, "promise to love, to honor, and to be faithful, in good times and bad." Her words faded, but she forced herself to continue, her lips trembling. "And though he's not here, I'll still keep my vows. Because love should not depend on someone's courage to stay." Her final words echoed faintly through the small church, landing somewhere between heartbreak and defiance. Then came silence again. Thick, painful silence. Outside, the wind carried laughter. Not joyful laughter, but sharp, mocking tones that pricked at her pride. Someone called out, "Guess the bride'll have to dance alone tonight." Another voice joined in, followed by the shuffle of boots moving away. Clara kept her gaze on the altar. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall where anyone could see. She didn't know that across the street, behind iron bars and the cold shadow of death, someone was watching. Elias Crowe sat on the narrow bench inside his jail cell, his wrists bound in iron cuffs. His face was rugged, lined from years of dust and sun, with a few days, stubble darkening his jaw. He wasn't what most would call handsome, but there was something striking in his stillness, a gravity that made even the sheriff tread carefully around him. Through the barred window, Elias had a clear view of the chapel. He'd been staring at it for an hour now, curious at first, then quietly absorbed. He had watched the woman in white arrive alone, watched her stand there, unmoving. And now, as she spoke her vows to the empty air, something strange twisted in his chest, a feeling he hadn't known in years. He wasn't a stranger to loneliness. He'd slept under open skies more nights than he could count, waking to the sound of his own breath and nothing else. But there was something different about the way this woman bore her solitude. It wasn't self-pity. It was courage, quiet and raw, the kind of courage that outlasts humiliation. The sheriff's deputy, a young man with a mean grin, leaned against the bars beside Elias and spat into the dirt. "Ain't that something? The prettiest girl in town, and she's marrying ghosts." Elias didn't answer. His eyes stayed on Clara, watching her fold her trembling hands in prayer. The deputy chuckled. "If I were her, I'd move far away. Ain't no use stayin' where everyone knows you got left at the altar." Elias's jaw tightened. "You ever been left standing, boy?" The deputy frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Means you don't know what it feels like when the whole world's watching. You crumble and you still gotta keep standing, Elias said quietly. That woman's got more grit than half the men in this town. The deputy rolled his eyes. You sound awful sentimental for a man about to hang. Elias gave a faint smirk. Maybe that's why it don't bother me none to say it. The deputy laughed. What are you gonna do, Crowe? Walk over there and hold her hand. Elias turned his gaze back toward the chapel. If I had the choice, he muttered, I'd stand beside her, just to prove a man still could. The voice came from behind him then, rough, but not unkind. You mean that, Elias? The sheriff stood in the doorway, arms crossed over his vest, his badge catching a slant of sunlight. He was an older man, gruff, tired, but fair. He had known Elias years before the outlaw life took him, back when he was just another ranch hand trying to stay fed. Elias didn't turn. Just talking, Sheriff. Talking's one thing, meanin' it's another. The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then sighed. You've got about as much chance of standing beside that woman as you do of walking free. But, he looked at the deputy, whose smirk faded. Fetch me the shackles. The deputy blinked. You serious? The sheriff nodded. Man's got a day left in him. He wants to see a wedding. Let him see one. Ain't no harm in decency. The town's gossip stopped dead when the church doors creaked open again. Clara, still clutching her bouquet, turned instinctively. Her breath caught. There, framed by the doorway, stood two deputies and a tall man in irons. His wrists were bound, his boots heavy with chains, but his back was straight. For a heartbeat, she thought the sight might be a cruel joke, that Thomas had returned. But no. The man's eyes were too dark, too steady. His presence carried the kind of weight that couldn't be faked. The sheriff tipped his hat. Miss Wynn, he said softly. This here's Elias Crowe, he asked to pay his respects. Thought you could use a witness. Clara looked from the sheriff to the prisoner. A witness? Elias inclined his head slightly, the movement slow, almost respectful. Didn't seem right, you standin', alone before God. The priest hesitated, unsure, but Clara surprised everyone, including herself, by nodding. Let him stay. The sheriff gave a curt nod, and the deputies led Elias to the very last pew. The sound of his chains echoed faintly against the wooden floor, like a slow, metallic heartbeat. He sat down quietly, folding his hands in his lap, his gaze steady but distant. Clara turned back toward the altar. Her pulse was unsteady, though she didn't know why. Perhaps it was the strangeness of it all. The empty chapel, the outlaw in chains, and her own trembling heart refusing to let go of its vows. The priest cleared his throat softly. Shall we continue, Miss Wynn? She nodded again. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Yes, please. As the priest spoke words of blessing over a wedding that would never truly happen, the light from the window fell across her face. Elias watched as her lips moved in prayer, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The lace on her sleeve fluttered when the breeze came through the open door, and for a moment, the world outside faded. He wasn't thinking about gallows or guilt or death, just the quiet strength of a woman who refused to let shame define her. When the ceremony ended, Clara didn't move. She stood there for several long breaths, then slowly turned. Her gaze met Elias's across the empty church. It was only a glance, seconds long, but something passed between them. Recognition, not of faces, but of souls that had both known loss too deeply to speak of it. Her eyes softened, almost a thank you, though her lips didn't move. Elias's gaze didn't waver. He didn't smile, didn't speak. He simply nodded once, as if to say, "You're not alone anymore." The sheriff gestured to the deputies, and they rose to lead Elias away. The sound of his chains echoed again, fading with each step. Clara watched him go, her bouquet slowly slipping from her hands. The lilies hit the floor with a soft thud, scattering petals across the aisle. When the doors shut behind them, she was alone once more. But it didn't feel quite the same this time. Somewhere between the silence and the sound of retreating boots, a small ember of something new had lit in her chest, something fragile but alive. Outside, Elias was led back across the dusty street toward the jail. The sky above Hollow Creek had turned the color of worn brass. He paused for a moment, glancing back over his shoulder at the chapel, then muttered under his breath, "Hell of a day for a wedding." The sheriff shot him a sideways look. "You got something to say, Crowe?" Elias smirked faintly. "Just that if there's one soul in this town worth praying for, Sheriff, it's hers." The older man studied him, then nodded. "Maybe you're right." As the door to the jail closed and the lock slid into place, Elias sat back down on his bench. Through the bars, he could still see the edge of the chapel's roof glowing in the sunset. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small scrap of fabric, an old piece of a torn handkerchief he'd carried for years, and ran his thumb over the frayed threads. For the first time in a long while, Elias Crowe felt something he couldn't name. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was close enough to make him believe that maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't finished after all. The morning sun spilled weakly through the dusty window panes of Hollow Creek's jailhouse, painting gold lines across the wooden floor. The air was cool, carrying the scent of coffee and iron. Elias Crowe sat on his cot, elbows on his knees, staring at the faint beam of light as it crept toward his boots. He had not slept much. The image of that woman in white still lingered behind his eyes, her voice trembling with grace, her eyes refusing to break. He didn't know why it stayed with him. Maybe because she had done what he could never do, stand proud when the whole world wanted you to fall. Outside, boots thudded against the boardwalk. The sheriff's deputy shuffled by with his usual smirk, tossing a biscuit through the bars. "Breakfast, Crowe. Try not to hang yourself before you eat." Elias caught it mid-air, smirking faintly. "You rehearse them jokes, or they come natural? Keep talking, outlaw. You won't be laughing in 2 weeks." "Maybe not," Elias said, biting into the stale biscuit. "But neither will you. Some of us just die slower." The deputy frowned, muttered something, and walked away. Elias chuckled softly under his breath and leaned back against the wall. His wrists ached where the irons had rubbed his skin raw, but he didn't complain. He'd known worse pains than chains. It was nearly noon when he heard the door creak open again. He looked up, expecting the sheriff, but instead he saw a shape framed in the light. A woman. The same woman from the chapel. Clara Wynn stood in the doorway, holding a wicker basket in both hands. She wore a pale blue dress, simple and neat, with her hair pinned up. The morning wind had loosened a few curls, and the sunlight caught them like threads of honey. She hesitated before stepping inside. The sheriff, sitting behind his desk, looked up from his papers. "Miss Wynn, didn't expect to see you here." Clara nodded politely. "I brought some stitching for Mrs. Harland. She's out back hanging laundry. I'll leave it here then." She set the basket down on the counter. But she didn't turn to go. Her eyes flicked toward the jail cells. Elias met her gaze, half curious, half smiling. The sheriff followed her glance, then sighed. "You don't need to talk to him, ma'am. He's not worth your time." Clara clasped her hands together. "I don't believe anyone's worthless, Sheriff." Elias chuckled quietly. "You'll make enemies talking like that, miss." Her gaze turned to him. "And yet, you came to my wedding." He leaned back on the cot. "Didn't do much good, did it?" "It did more than you think," she said softly. The sheriff grumbled. "All right, that's enough chit-chat. Crowe's hanging soon. Ain't no use getting attached to dead men." Clara straightened. "If that's true, then I'll visit while he's still alive." Elias tilted his head, surprised by her boldness. The sheriff frowned, but finally waved her on. 5 minutes? Don't hand him nothing, sharp." Clara stepped closer to the bars. Her eyes studied him carefully, not the way people usually looked at outlaws, with fear or disgust, but with something closer to curiosity. "They said you were dangerous," she murmured. He smirked. "They say that about anyone who don't fit the mold. You don't deny it." "I don't have much reason to." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "You really come all the way here just to talk?" "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for being there." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Wasn't much of a guest." "Still," she replied, "you showed up when no one else did." Something flickered in his eyes then. Something quiet and honest. "Most folks only remember me for 11 places. Never for showin' up. A small smile touched her lips. Then let today be different. The sheriff coughed pointedly. Clara stepped back, nodding politely. Good day, Sheriff. Mr. Crowe? She turned and left, her skirt brushing against the wooden floor, leaving the faint scent of lilac behind. Elias watched her go until the door swung shut, then leaned back against the wall again, his smirk fading into something thoughtful. The sheriff glanced at him. Don't get ideas. About what? About her. Elias shrugged. Didn't say I had any. The sheriff grunted. She's a good girl. Don't drag her into your shadow. Elias looked toward the light spilling through the window. Maybe she ain't afraid of shadows, Sheriff. Maybe she's just tired of the folks who cast 'em. Over the next week, she returned again and again. Sometimes with sewing, sometimes with food, sometimes with nothing but conversation. The sheriff eventually stopped protesting, grumbling that if Elias behaved, it kept the jailhouse quiet. Each time, their words grew longer, softer. Clara would sit in the wooden chair just outside his cell while the afternoon light painted long stripes across the floor. One day she brought him a small cloth bundle, bread and dried apples. You shouldn't trouble yourself, he said. It's no trouble. You think feedin' a condemned man is charity? No, she said, unwrapping the cloth carefully. It's decency, and maybe company. He looked at her then, studying her face, the faint freckles, the tiredness behind her eyes. You're too kind for this town, he said. She smiled faintly. People say that like it's a weakness. Maybe it is. Kind people don't last long out here. I've lasted this far. He laughed quietly. Fair point. They talked of small things, weather, sewing, the noise of the saloon across the street. But now and then, her curiosity crept through. Do you miss your home? She asked one afternoon. He was silent for a long time. Then, I ain't never had one worth missin'. No family? My ma died when I was young, never knew my pa. Learned early that you either take what's left or go hungry. I'm sorry, she said softly. He shrugged. Don't be. The world don't owe anyone a gentle hand. Later, as the sun dropped low and the jail filled with the orange light of evening, Clara folded her hands in her lap. Elias, she said quietly, why did they arrest you? His jaw tightened. You really want to know? I asked, didn't I? He exhaled slowly. They say I killed a man. Her breath caught. Did you? He met her eyes. No, but I know who did, and that's worse somehow, because I can't prove it. Who? He hesitated, looking down. A man named Thomas Granger. The name hit her like a strike to the chest. Her fingers trembled before she could hide it. Thomas Granger? He nodded. You know him? She forced a swallow. Yes, he was. She stopped. He was supposed to be my husband. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them grew heavy, thick with something unspoken. Elias's eyes softened. Then I'm sorry for that, miss, for both of us. Clara stared at the floor. What happened? He caught me looking at his books. He'd been sellin' cattle that weren't his, coverin' tracks with false ledgers. I told him I'd turn him in. He aimed a pistol at me. We struggled. The gun went off. His foreman dropped dead. Thomas screamed murder and ran for the sheriff before I could say a word. And they believed him, she whispered. Why wouldn't they? He's rich. I'm not. The truth sank deep inside her like a stone in still water. The man she had loved, the man who'd humiliated her, had not only abandoned her, but condemned another to die for his sins. Her voice shook. If you had proof. I don't, Elias said quietly. All I had was my word, and a thief's word ain't worth spit in court. Clara's eyes burned with anger she didn't know she still had. Maybe it will be, someday. He smiled, tired and bitter. You sound like you believe in justice. I believe in truth, she said. He tilted his head. They ain't always the same. That night, after she left, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying her voice in his mind. For the first time in years, something stirred in him that wasn't bitterness or regret. Hope, faint and fragile, but alive. Days passed. The jail grew quieter. the gossip louder. The townsfolk whispered that the seamstress was visiting a criminal, that she'd lost her mind after being jilted. Clara ignored them. She kept going, her resolve hardening each time someone looked at her with pity. One afternoon she arrived carrying a folded handkerchief embroidered with a single white star. She handed it to Elias through the bars. "What's this for?" he asked. "Something to hold on to," she said, "when it gets dark." He turned it over in his hands, tracing the stitches. "You made this?" "Yes." He looked up at her, his voice quieter now. "You're the first person to ever give me something, without wanting something back." She smiled faintly. "Maybe I just wanted to remind you that you're still human." He looked away, swallowing hard. "That's dangerous talk, miss. You'll start making me believe it." Outside, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. Storms rolled fast over Hollow Creek that time of year. The sheriff came in, glancing between them. "Time's almost up, Clara. He's got 2 weeks." Her voice didn't waver. "Then I'll visit until there's no time left." The sheriff studied her a moment longer, then turned away without another word. Elias watched her, jaw tight. "You don't quit easy, do you?" She shook her head. "Neither do you." He laughed softly. "Guess we got that in common." That evening, as the rain began to fall, Elias sat with the embroidered handkerchief in his palm. He turned it over once, then again, before tucking it into his shirt pocket. He could hear the faint drip of water outside, the creak of the hanging post swaying in the wind. Death waited for him just beyond those walls, but now it felt different, less like an ending, more like a question still waiting to be answered. He thought of her eyes, the way they held his without flinching. He thought of her hands, trembling but determined, the way she looked when she spoke of truth. Something inside him, something he'd long buried, began to shift. Maybe it wasn't too late to be something better than what the world said he was. He closed his eyes and murmured into the silence. "Guess I'll make a promise of my own, Clara Wynn. You came here to remind me I still got a soul. Maybe before I die I'll find a way to prove you right." Outside, lightning split the sky, and Hollow Creek slept under the sound of rain. But in that dim jail cell, one man sat awake, heart restless, waiting for the morning, and for the first time in years, believing it might actually come. The days after the storm settled into a strange rhythm for Clara Wynn. Every morning she would open the shutters of her small tailor shop, sweep the dust from the steps, and try to ignore the whispers that followed her wherever she went. The townsfolk had grown bold in their gossip. Too bold. It was one thing to pity a woman left at the altar. It was another to see her walking through town with her head high, carrying baskets of food to the jailhouse. "She's lost her mind," murmured the blacksmith's wife. "Talking to a killer as if he's a preacher," said another. Clara pretended not to hear. She had learned long ago that silence was its own kind of armor. Inside, her hands moved automatically through the motions of work, cutting, stitching, hemming. But her mind stayed elsewhere. Every needle stroke brought back his face. Elias Crowe behind the iron bars, calm and steady, his dark eyes glinting like flint when he talked of truth. She hadn't meant to care. She told herself that kindness was just kindness. But each day she found another reason to go back. Sometimes she carried mended shirts for the sheriff's deputies. Sometimes a basket of fruit for the prisoners. Sometimes only the excuse of conversation. And every time, Elias was waiting. He never asked why she came. He simply stood when she entered, nodding in quiet acknowledgement. Some days they spoke of small things, the weather, the rickety piano in the saloon, the way the sunsets looked over the ridge. Other days they fell into silence so comfortable it startled her. But lately, that silence carried a current beneath it. Something unspoken. Something that frightened her more than the glares of the townsfolk. One evening, after the sheriff had stepped out to check on his horse, she stood close to the bars, her hands gripping the cold iron. "You said you didn't kill him," she whispered. "But you never told me what proof you have." Elias looked up slowly, the shadow of the lamplight cutting across his face. "You really think anyone in this town would care for proof?" "I would," she said quietly. His eyes softened. "That's what scares me." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Thomas Granger, you're Thomas." He kept ledgers, detailed ones. Every deal, every dollar. I saw them with my own eyes. He was skimming from the cattle drives, falsifying numbers, paying off men to keep quiet. That's what I caught him doing." "Then why didn't you say that at your trial?" Elias gave a bitter laugh. "You ever tried accusing a rich man when you've got dirt under your fingernails and a bounty on your head? They'd sooner hang you for the shape of your hat." Clara's grip on the bars tightened. If those ledgers still exist, they could prove everything. "They were hidden on his ranch," he said. "But he'd have moved them by now. He's not stupid." "Maybe not," she murmured. "But he's careless. I know that better than anyone." She stepped back, heart racing. Elias's brow furrowed. "You're not thinking what I think you're thinking. I have to try. You step foot on his land, and you'll end up in the next cell beside me." Clara met his gaze, unflinching. "Then, at least we'll both know I tried." Before he could answer, the sheriff returned, and she left with a polite nod. But that night, as the lamps dimmed across Hollow Creek, Clara packed a small satchel, wrapped a lantern in cloth, and slipped out into the wind. The road to the Granger Ranch was dark and uneven, a narrow trail that wound through mesquite and tumbleweed. Her horse's hooves struck softly against the dry earth. She had not ridden this way since the day Thomas first proposed to her under the old cottonwood tree. Now the sight of that tree made her stomach twist. The house rose ahead, wide and proud, lights burning in 2 upstairs windows. The ranch hands' quarters were quiet. Most were likely passed out in the bunkhouse after a long day's drinking. She tied her horse behind a row of barrels and crept toward the back door. The moon slipped behind a cloud, and the world fell into near darkness. Inside, the house smelled of whiskey and old tobacco. Her shoes sank into thick carpets as she moved through the hall, her lantern barely a whisper of light. Every creak of the floorboards made her heart lurch. She had spent months helping Thomas decorate this house, choosing curtains and dishes, planning a life that would never come. Now she moved through it like a ghost. The study door stood slightly ajar. She pushed it open and slipped inside. The air was heavy, with cigar smoke and dust. Papers littered the desk, and a decanter of brandy gleamed faintly in the dark. She set down her lantern and began to search through drawers, beneath stacks of invoices, behind the shelves of account books. Her fingers brushed against a false panel at the back of the bottom drawer. With a soft click, it came loose. Behind it lay a leather-bound book, thick and worn, its edges smudged with ink and dirt. She opened it, and her breath caught. There they were. Names, dates, figures, all written in Thomas's precise hand. Sales that never happened. Payments made to men she didn't recognize. Even a note. E.C. Settled permanently. Her stomach turned. "Looking for something, sweetheart?" The voice froze her. Thomas stood in the doorway, half drunk, his shirt open at the collar, a revolver hanging loosely in his hand. His smile was a slow, dangerous curve. "Didn't expect you back here. Thought you'd be sewing wedding dresses for other fools by now." Clara hid the ledger behind her skirt. "I came to collect what belongs to me." He laughed. "And what's that? A broken promise?" She straightened. "The truth." His eyes narrowed as he stepped closer. "You've been talking to that outlaw, haven't you?" "Sheriff told me you've been visiting." Her pulse quickened. "He told me what you did." Thomas's face darkened. "He told you lies, you mean?" She shook her head. "This says otherwise." She lifted the ledger, holding it tight to her chest. For a second he froze. Then the lazy grin vanished, replaced by fury. "You don't know what you're doing, Clara." "I know you framed an innocent man to save your name." He took another step forward. "Put the book down." "No." "Put it down, or I swear I'll—" A voice interrupted from the hallway. "Mr. Granger?" It was his foreman, half asleep, knocking softly. Thomas cursed under his breath. Clara seized the chance. She bolted past him, clutching the ledger, knocking over the lantern on the desk. The flame flared as oil spilled, licking up the papers. "Clara!" Thomas shouted, lunging for her sleeve. But she tore free, running down the hall and out the back door. The night exploded behind her as fire caught the drapes. She mounted her horse and galloped toward town, the wind tearing at her hair, the precious book pressed against her ribs. Behind her, orange light rose against the sky. By the time she reached Hollow Creek, Dawn was breaking. Her dress was torn, her face streaked with soot. She burst through the door of the jailhouse, startling the sheriff from his coffee. "Miss Wynn, what in God's name?" "I found it," she gasped, slamming the ledger onto his desk. "Everything. The proof Elias told you about. Thomas Granger's been stealing, forging, paying off witnesses." The sheriff blinked, then opened the book. His brows knit as he flipped through the pages. "Well, I'll be damned." He looked up sharply. "You realize what this means? That you have to stop the hanging," she said. He rubbed his jaw. "The governor's the only one who can do that. He's 2 towns over in Redwood. I can telegraph him, but it might take days to reach." "We don't have days," she said. "He hangs tomorrow." The sheriff hesitated, then stood. "All right, I'll send the wire, but you best get home and rest." "I'll rest when he's free." She turned toward the cells. Elias was already standing, his hands gripping the bars, eyes wide. "Clara, what did you do?" She smiled faintly, breathless. "I went back to where it all started." "You're insane," he said softly, half laughing. "Maybe," she replied, "but I'm right." She handed him a torn page she'd copied from the ledger, his initials, the false entry, the proof that Thomas had lied. Elias held it like it was something holy. His voice broke. "You could have been killed." "I'm still here," she said. He stared at her, a storm behind his eyes. "You shouldn't have done it. Would you rather I let you hang for him?" He shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am, but now I got something I never had before." "What's that?" "Someone to lose." For a moment, they just looked at each other through the bars. Then the sheriff cleared his throat, awkwardly. "All right, that's enough moonlight poetry. I'll send the telegram." Clara stepped back, still trembling. The room smelled of smoke and rain, but for the first time in months, she felt the weight in her chest begin to lift. That night, the wind returned. Hollow Creek slept uneasily under clouds that rolled low and heavy, promising another storm. In his cell, Elias sat awake, the copied page resting beside him. He traced the ink with his thumb, whispering her name. He didn't know what would happen come morning. Maybe the governor's word would arrive in time. Maybe it wouldn't. But either way, he'd found something worth believing in again. Across town, Clara sat by her window, watching lightning flicker on the horizon. Her hands were raw, her throat burned, but she felt alive in a way she never had before. The fire she'd started at Thomas's ranch had spread fast. She'd seen the glow from miles away. The town would soon know everything. For now, she could only wait and hope the truth traveled faster than lies. Outside, thunder rolled, shaking the shutters. She whispered into the dark, "Hold on, Elias." Just one more night, and miles away in his cell, he whispered almost the same words back to the wind. Rain began before dawn, a slow, whispering drizzle that turned the dust of Hollow Creek into mud. The wind pressed against the windows of the sheriff's office, rattling the panes. Inside, the air felt heavy with waiting. The ledger sat open on the desk beside a cold cup of coffee, its ink smudged from Clara's trembling fingers the night before. The sheriff had sent the telegram at sundown, but no reply had come. Clara sat in a wooden chair near the stove, her eyes fixed on the clock above the door. Each tick sounded louder than the last. Elias was still in his cell, sitting quietly, the damp air darkening his hair and shirt. He hadn't spoken much since she arrived that morning. There was nothing left to say, except to wait for the sound of the telegraph. Outside, the gallows waited, a dark shape rising above the muddy yard. Men were already gathering, pulling their coats tight against the rain. Hollow Creek had always loved a spectacle. The sheriff came in from the back room, hat dripping, eyes shadowed. "Still no word," he muttered. He looked at Clara. "Governor's clerk promised to pass it along. Maybe the wires are down in Redwood." Her voice was quiet, almost steady. "How long do we have?" "Execution set for sunrise." Her gaze flicked toward the window. The sky was gray and bruised, the first hints of dawn coloring the edges of the horizon. Her hands trembled on her lap, but she said nothing. Elias looked at her through the bars, watching every small movement. "Sheriff," he said finally, "you mind giving us a minute?" The sheriff hesitated, then nodded. "You got 5. He turned and stepped outside, the door closing with a soft thud. Clara rose, crossing the small space to the bars. "They'll come," she said. Elias shook his head slowly. "You don't need to lie for my sake. I'm not lying." He smiled faintly. Tired but warm. "You always were a terrible liar, Clara Wynn." Her breath caught. "You make it sound like we've known each other forever." "Feels like it," he said. "You brought light into a place that ain't seen it in a long time." For a moment, silence settled between them, thick and fragile. Rain drummed against the roof. She wanted to reach for him but stopped herself. The chains on his wrists glinted faintly in the dim light. "Elias," she whispered, "if they don't come." He lifted his hand, stopping her. "Then I want you to remember something. You didn't fail me. You gave me back something I'd already buried." "What's that?" He looked straight at her. "Hope." Her throat tightened. "Don't talk like that. You're not done." He smiled. "Everybody's done eventually, but not everybody gets to know what it feels like to be seen before they go." The words broke something inside her. She pressed her hand against the bars, and he mirrored the gesture, his rough palm against hers, cold iron between them. Neither spoke for a long time. Then the door burst open. The sheriff strode in, dripping with rain, his face pale. "No reply yet!" Clara turned sharply. "Then send another!" "Lines are down," he said. "Lightning struck the post outside town." Her voice cracked. "No! No! There has to be another way." He shook his head. "Not in time." Elias exhaled slowly, leaning back. "Guess that settles it." "No," Clara said fiercely. "Not yet." She turned to the sheriff. "Let me ride to Redwood. I can take the ledger myself." The sheriff frowned. "It's 50 miles through flooded ground. You'd never make it before morning." "I have to try." Elias spoke softly. "Clara?" She turned to him, eyes wild. "Don't you dare tell me not to." He smiled sadly. "Wasn't gonna. Just wanted to say thank you." The sheriff rubbed his temple. "I can't stop you, but I won't lie. If you go out there now, it's suicide." She snatched the ledger from the desk, wrapping it in oilcloth. "Then I'll die doing something worth it." Before he could answer, she was already through the door, swallowed by rain and wind. The storm had grown fierce by the time she reached the edge of town. Water streamed through the ruts in the road, turning each step of her horse into a struggle. She leaned low over the saddle, the cold biting through her dress. Lightning split the sky in jagged veins of white, followed by thunder that rolled like cannon fire. She whispered to the horse, urging it onward. "Come on, Daisy. Come on, girl. We can make it." The animal's breath came in bursts of steam, its hooves splashing mud up to her knees. Every mile stretched longer than the last. Her fingers were numb. Her face stung with rain, but she didn't stop. Behind her, Hollow Creek disappeared into darkness. Ahead, the open plains stretched endless and merciless. She thought of Elias, his calm voice, the way his eyes softened when he said her name. That image kept her upright when her muscles screamed for rest. She didn't know how long she rode. Hours, maybe more. The rain never eased. When the horse stumbled, she almost went down with it, clutching the saddle horn to stay upright. The ledger pressed against her chest, the only warmth left in the world. At last, a light appeared through the rain. A small station on the edge of Redwood County, where the telegraph operator lived. She spurred the horse forward, sliding down before it stopped moving. Her boots hit the ground with a splash. She ran to the door and pounded with her fist. A thin man in spectacles opened it, startled. "Ma'am, what?" "I need this sent to the governor," she gasped, slamming the ledger onto his counter. "It's proof. A man's innocent. He's to hang at sunrise." He blinked, confused. "Governor's clerk's out for the night." "Wake him," she cried. "Please, if you don't, you'll be sending an innocent man to his grave." Something in her voice broke his hesitation. He grabbed the ledger, flipping it open, his eyes widening at the contents. "All right, ma'am. All right, I'll send it now." He hurried to the telegraph machine, tapping the key with shaking hands. Sparks jumped, wires hummed. Clara slumped against the wall, her body trembling with exhaustion. The operator finished and looked up. "It's sent, but the line's bad in this weather. I can't promise he'll get it in time." She nodded weakly. "He has to." Outside, thunder rolled again, closer this time. She stepped back into the rain, mounting her horse with the last of her strength. "We're going back, girl," she whispered. "He's waiting." Back in Hollow Creek, dawn was breaking. The storm still raged, but the sky had lightened to a dull gray. The crowd had gathered near the gallows, boots sinking into the mud. The sheriff stood near the steps, his hat low, shoulders tight. Elias stood beside him, hands bound, shirt clinging to his skin. He looked calm, almost peaceful. When the deputy approached with the rope, Elias looked up at the sky. "Hell of a sunrise," he said softly. The sheriff's jaw clenched. "You don't have to joke." "Wasn't a joke, just truth." He took a deep breath as they led him up the steps. The crowd murmured. Some faces were eager, others solemn. A few turned away. The priest stepped forward, holding a Bible. "Elias Crowe, do you have any last words?" Elias looked out over the crowd. His voice was steady. "Yeah, don't believe everything you hear." He glanced at the sheriff. "And tell her she didn't fail." The rope was lowered. He placed it around his neck without protest. The rain began to fall harder, drumming against the wooden platform. Then, from the distance, came a sound. Hooves, fast and frantic. The sheriff turned first, squinting through the mist. A horse burst into view, its rider bent low, soaked and covered in mud. "Hold!" the sheriff shouted. "Hold everything!" The deputy froze. Elias's eyes widened. Clara rode into the square, nearly sliding from the saddle, clutching a sealed paper in one hand. "Stop!" she screamed. "I have it! I have the governor's order!" The sheriff caught her as she stumbled off the horse. She thrust the document into his hands, breath ragged. "He's innocent! The governor's signature! It's all there!" The sheriff tore it open, scanning quickly. Then he looked up, shouting, "Cut the rope!" The crowd gasped. The deputy fumbled with the knot, slicing it loose. The rope fell away, and Elias collapsed to his knees, rain mixing with the dirt on his face. Clara ran forward, falling beside him. He lifted his head slowly, disbelief and relief flooding his eyes. "You made it," he whispered. She was crying and laughing at once. "I told you I would." He smiled weakly. "Guess I owe you a dance after all." The sheriff stepped forward, voice rough. "You're free, Crowe. Official pardon." Elias looked up, still kneeling. "Never thought I'd hear that." "You can thank her?" the sheriff said. He turned to Clara, reaching out, his chains clinking softly. She took his hands, her fingers trembling. "You saved my life," he murmured. She shook her head. "You saved mine first." Around them, the crowd began to disperse, murmuring in shock. The gallows stood empty in the rain, the rope swinging gently in the wind. The sun broke faintly through the clouds, a thin blade of gold slicing across the gray. Elias rose slowly, still holding her hand. The sheriff looked away, pretending not to see the tears on his own face. "Get him out of those irons," he muttered to the deputy. When the chains fell, Elias flexed his wrists, the skin red and raw. Clara reached up and touched the marks gently. "You're free," she whispered. He looked at her, voice low. "Not just yet, not till you smile again." For the first time in months, she did. A real, trembling smile that lit her face even through the rain. He brushed a strand of wet hair from her cheek, then dropped his hand, uncertain. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Go home, both of you. This town's seen enough ghosts for one day." Elias nodded. "Yes, sir." He turned to Clara, eyes soft. "Come on, Miss Wynn, let's get out of this rain." They walked together through the muddy street, side by side, while behind them the gallows swayed empty in the storm. The crowd had gone quiet, and the only sound left was the soft rhythm of their footsteps and the distant ring of the church bell, the same one that had tolled on her wedding day. Now it sounded different. As they reached the edge of town, Elias stopped and looked back. "Strange thing, life," he said softly. "Sometimes it hangs by a rope, sometimes by a person." She looked up at him. "And sometimes," she said, "it's both." He smiled at that, a tired, beautiful smile that carried everything unsaid between them. Then they walked on together, the rain easing, the first true morning of their new lives rising over the wet, shining fields. The storm left Hollow Creek washed clean. By the time the sun broke through, puddles shimmered like bits of broken mirror across the main road, and the smell of wet cedar filled the air. The gallows stood empty, its rope cut and frayed, the wood still dripping from rain. The townsfolk who had come to watch a hanging now whispered about miracles instead. Clara hadn't slept. She sat by the stove in the sheriff's office, Elias's coat draped around her shoulders. Her fingers clutched the mug of coffee the sheriff's wife had pressed into her hands, though the coffee had long gone cold. Her eyes kept drifting toward the door, half expecting someone to say it had all been a dream, that the governor's order hadn't come, that the noose had still fallen. But every time she looked up, she saw Elias through the cracked window, standing outside beneath the rising light, alive. He had changed his shirt, the fresh one given by the sheriff's wife, though the collar didn't fit right. His hair was damp, falling across his forehead. He was speaking quietly with the sheriff, who nodded once, then clapped him on the shoulder. Whatever words passed between them were lost to the sound of horses and morning bustle. When Elias finally stepped back inside, his eyes found Clara instantly. He smiled faintly, cautious, as if uncertain whether he was allowed to. She rose without thinking, the chair scraping softly against the floor. "You're free," she said again, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded. "Feels strange, like I'm walking in borrowed air. Maybe that's what freedom feels like at first." He looked at her a long time, then said softly, "Don't reckon I'd be breathing at all if not for you." Before she could answer, the sheriff cleared his throat. "Crowe, governor's papers say you're cleared of all charges. You can stay in Hollow Creek or move on. Either way, you're your own man again." Elias gave a dry laugh. "Ain't sure what a man's supposed to do with that." "Start over," Clara said quietly. He turned toward her. "Easier said than done." "Then let me help you." The sheriff's eyes flicked between them, a knowing smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Well, you two sort that out. I've got enough to handle explaining to the circuit judge why the town nearly hung an innocent man." He tipped his hat and stepped outside. For a long moment they stood in silence, the kind that holds too much meaning for words. Then Elias spoke, voice low. "I should go. Ain't exactly welcome company for decent folks." Clara shook her head. "You think I care what they whisper? They'll call you worse things than kind if you're seen walking with me." "They already do." He smiled, rueful and gentle. "You're something else, Clara Wynn." She stepped closer, her eyes searching his. "You said once you owed me your life. Don't. You've already paid it. Every time you believed me." Outside, the sun rose higher, scattering light through the mist. The church bell rang faintly in the distance, the same one that had tolled for her empty wedding. Its echo drifted through the streets, softer now, less cruel. Elias's gaze followed the sound. "That bell again," he murmured. "Never thought I'd hear it without wanting to run." "It used to sound like loss," she said. "Now it sounds like a beginning." By afternoon, the town began to settle into its new story. People came by her shop again, timid, apologetic. The blacksmith's wife brought her a basket of fresh bread. The pastor's daughter left a small jar of honey on the windowsill. They didn't speak of what they'd said before, only smiled awkwardly and went on their way. Clara worked quietly, stitching a hem as the sun warmed her small window. She didn't expect him to come that day, but near evening, when the shadows stretched long and gold across the floor, the door creaked open and he stepped inside. He stood there for a moment, hat in hand, looking almost shy. "Didn't mean to interrupt," she set her needle down, smiling. "You never interrupt." He glanced around the room. "You sew all this yourself?" "Every stitch," he nodded, tracing a fingertip over the edge of a folded dress. "You've got hands made for mending the world, and you've got hands that have seen too much of it," she said softly. He chuckled under his breath. "Maybe, but they're steady now. That's a start." She gestured toward the chair near the counter. "Sit. You look like you haven't eaten." I haven't, he admitted, lowering himself onto the chair. She brought him a plate. Simple stew left from her lunch. He ate slowly, glancing at her between bites. I've been thinking, he said. That sounds dangerous. He grinned faintly. Maybe. Sheriff offered me work. Said he could use another hand at his ranch. Honest work, steady pay. That's good, she said. You'll stay then? He hesitated. Wasn't sure I should. Her voice softened. Why not? He met her eyes. 'Cause stayin' means carin', and I ain't sure I know how to do that anymore. Her heart clenched, but she smiled. Then you'll learn. People do when they have reason to. He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You might just be that reason. The words hung in the air like something fragile and alive. She turned away, pretending to tidy the counter, though her hands trembled slightly. Behind her, his voice dropped low. When I was in that cell, I kept thinking about the way you looked that day in the chapel. I thought it was pity at first. But it wasn't, was it? She shook her head. No, it was recognition. He smiled faintly. Two fools standing, alone in front of God. Not fools, she said, just people who refused to give up. He stood then, stepping closer. The space between them felt charged, like the air before lightning. Clara, he said quietly, what do you want from all this? She looked up at him, her voice steady. A life that's ours, not what the town says it should be, just ours. He swallowed hard, his eyes softening. You sure? Yes. He reached out slowly, touching her cheek with rough fingers. She didn't move away. The warmth of his hand against her skin was real, grounding. His thumb brushed a strand of hair from her face. You deserve better than a man with blood on his hands. You were framed, she said. I was an outlaw before that. I stole, I lied, I ran. But you could start over clean. She smiled sadly. Maybe I don't want clean. Maybe I just want real. He exhaled shakily, the fight leaving him. God help me, Clara. Maybe he already did, she whispered. He kissed her then, softly, uncertain at first, as if afraid she'd vanish. She didn't. The world outside faded to quiet. When he finally pulled back, his forehead rested against hers. They stayed that way until the light faded from the window. Then he stepped away, clearing his throat. I should get back before the sheriff thinks I've robbed you blind, she laughed softly. You already have. He paused at the door, glancing back. I'll see you tomorrow? Tomorrow, she said. And the next day. Weeks passed, and Hollow Creek began to forget its old story. Elias worked at the sheriff's ranch, mending fences, breaking horses, hauling lumber. He earned his pay in sweat and quiet dignity. The townsfolk started to nod at him in passing. The blacksmith even offered him a beer one evening. Clara watched the change with quiet pride. Each morning he stopped by her shop before work, just long enough to tip his hat and steal a smile. Some evenings they walked together by the river that cut through the edge of town, where the reeds whispered in the wind. Once, she asked him if he ever thought of leaving. He shook his head. Used to think I'd ride till the world ran out of roads. Now I figure I finally found the end of one worth staying on. They talked about everything and nothing. His childhood, her dreams, the smell of rain on the prairie. He learned to laugh again, and she learned to trust that laughter. Then one evening, near the start of spring, he came to her shop carrying something small and wrapped in cloth. What's this? She asked. He smiled. Something I've been working on after hours. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside lay a ring. Simple, silver, a small blue stone set in the middle. It wasn't perfect. The metal was slightly uneven, the polish rough, but it gleamed in the lamplight like something honest. Her throat tightened. Elias. He took a breath. I can't give you land or money or anything fancy, but I can give you a promise that I'll never run again. That I'll stand beside you same way you stood beside me. Tears blurred her vision. She couldn't speak, only nodded. He smiled softly. Then I guess I ought to ask proper. Clara Wynn, would you marry me? She let out a trembling laugh. You know I will. He slipped the ring onto her finger. Then we best tell the preacher. The news spread faster than wildfire. This time, when the church bells rang, the whole town came. The women brought flowers. The men swept the chapel steps. Even the children peeked through the windows, whispering excitedly about the outlaw and the seamstress. Clara stood before the mirror in her small room, wearing the same dress she'd once worn alone. But it felt different now. Not a shroud of shame, but a symbol of everything she had survived. She touched the fabric gently, remembering every tear she'd shed into its threads, and smiled. Outside, the sun poured gold over the hills. Elias waited by the altar, his hands clasped, nerves showing in the way he shifted his weight. The sheriff stood beside him as best man, scowling to hide his grin. When the doors opened, every voice went quiet. Clara stepped inside, the light falling behind her like a halo. She walked down the aisle without hesitation, her eyes locked on his. The air felt thick with warmth and forgiveness. When she reached him, he whispered, "You sure this time there's no rope waitin' at the end?" She smiled. "Only forever." The preacher began to speak, his words soft and steady. When it came time for the vows, Elias's voice trembled only once. "I was supposed to die that day," he said quietly, loud enough for all to hear. "But instead, I met life. Wearin' white." The crowd went silent, moved beyond words. Clara's eyes shone with tears, but her voice was strong when she replied. "And I met love, in chains that never truly bound him." The preacher smiled. "Then, by the grace of God, I pronounce you husband and wife." Elias leaned forward, kissed her softly, and the crowd erupted, clapping, cheering, laughing. Even the old men who had once mocked her wiped their eyes. When they stepped out of the chapel, the sky blazed orange and gold, the bell ringing bright and full. He lifted her hand, kissing her knuckles. "You hear that?" he said. "They finally came to your wedding." She laughed through her tears. Guess they had to see it to believe it. They walked down the steps together, sunlight glinting off the silver ring, the air full of music and laughter. Behind them, the church doors swung wide, and for the first time, Hollow Creek felt like a place that had forgiven itself. As they reached the street, Elias pulled her close, whispering, "We're free now, Clara." She smiled, resting her head against his chest. "We always were. We just needed to remember." The wind carried their laughter down the road, across the golden fields, and into the open sky, where no gallows, no shame, no past could ever touch them again. In the heart of a town that once thrived on judgment and whispers, Clara Wynn and Elias Crowe proved that love can bloom even from the deepest wounds. Their story wasn't about perfection. It was about redemption, courage, and the quiet strength of two souls who chose each other when the world turned away. From the gallows to the altar, they showed that the truest freedom isn't found in escape, but in the arms of someone who finally understands you. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles, where every tale of dust, danger, and devotion reminds us that even in the roughest frontier, love always finds its way. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next unforgettable story of passion and redemption from the untamed West.